Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear subject, 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic, as always. This week we have a guest joining us, a fan of the show, probably listened to most, if not all, and has given both criticism and good feedback. We appreciate all of it. Today we have Travis Reese on the show with us. Welcome, Travis.
Hey, thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me here.
Thanks for coming. Travis is on the field most of the time and flies professionally. He gives us a number of show ideas, but the last couple of weeks he brought up a few topics, and we're going to try and incorporate most, if not all of them, in the next couple of weeks. But Travis flies a couple of jet aircraft and wanted to talk about the progression to bigger, higher performing aircraft. And we thought the first of maybe a few part series we would just talk about the high performance endorsement and the complex endorsement today. Get some DPE opinions on thoughts around those endorsements and maybe the commercial certificate and what pilots should be thinking about as they progress. And then real world stuff from Travis as he's migrated his way through many different single engine and multi-engine and turbo and jet type aircraft. And then me, I fly a 230 horsepower 1A2 a lot, and I will talk about what I've experienced there as well. So let's jump right in. So a lot of this, technically, if you remember Pat being on the show and always talking about what's the book say, the book on this is really the Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 11, Transitioning to Complex Aircraft. And what I find interesting preparing for the show is when I was a rookie pilot, young in my time in the cockpit, I never thought I would fly something complex. And now I've had the luck and joy of flying a jet, sitting second seat in a jet, and I fly a high-performance aircraft almost every time I fly. And I think pilots need to prepare for that. Obviously, if you want to be a professional pilot, you might be going to training like Wally will soon on a 777 one day, and that's a pretty high-performing aircraft, true?
Yeah, absolutely.
And complex.
Well, technically it is not complex because it does not have a controllable pitch propeller.
There you go.
So a 777 is not a complex airplane.
But it has a pretty long equipment list.
It does. It does.
So I think we talk a lot about checklist usage. We talk a lot about training, what we hear on the radios and single engine aircraft. But Travis, you brought this up. What are your thoughts around the GA world, general aviation, and what pilots are going to experience as they continue to move up the ranks in aircraft?
I think that the biggest thing that I wanted to bring was just kind of what to expect as you move through in advance and what you should be doing now to prepare for that as you get those opportunities in the future. Talk about checklist usage, systems, speed, performance. What can you expect out of that as you move into higher performance aircraft?
Yeah, so let's do some defining for the listeners. So what defines a high performance aircraft? Something that can have an engine that generates more than 200 horsepower. So not 200 horsepower. There's a lot of aircraft out there that have 200 horsepower engines. I think the Aero is one that's been misconceived on this field or at this school before. We had an Aero that was a PAR 201 was the model number, but the engine was a 200 horsepower engine, and a lot of people thought that they were flying a high-performance aircraft. They weren't. It was a 200 horsepower engine. A lot of twins have 180 on each side, but that's not a high-performance aircraft because neither engine can produce more than 200 horsepower. And then complex. One of you guys want to take the complex? What defines a complex?
Yeah, three things on a complex airplane. It's movable flaps, which we're all used to having. Pretty much every airplane that most of us fly have that. But the other two things are a retractable landing gear and a controllable pitch propeller.
And my mind jumps to systems, like you said, Travis. I think if you're a young pilot and you fly a 172 or a Warrior and you don't know how the systems in that aircraft work, to add on gear, constant speed prop, other things, and you don't know how those systems work, you're just going to build a deficit in your aviation career.
Yes, you've got to start and build on that. And, we're talking about the book definition of high performance, but take the guy that learned to fly in a J3 Cub, and he's now moving into a 172. For him, that's a higher performance aircraft than what he started in. It may not meet the book definition of high performance that we're talking about, but still a higher performance aircraft with more systems in a 172 than he probably had in that J3 Cub.
No doubt. And probably in today's world, a little bit of glass or a little bit of engine monitor or something that the J3 didn't have. And we'll talk more about systems, but I think it is the performance that you speak of. I might be a multi-engine pilot, but I can fly a multi-engine aircraft that I'm not really ready to fly too. You put me into a Baron with what do they have? 280s on the sides or 265s?
Yeah, at a minimum.
Yeah.
At a minimum. Yeah.
So I'm used to flying a light twin with two 180s. If I had an engine failure in a Baron, it's going to roll a lot faster and a lot more violently than I would expect in the travel there. So just because you're rated for something doesn't mean you should maybe jump in those things and fly them. I'm still a rookie pilot compared to both of y'all. I'll talk about my experiences. I think moving from Cessna to low wing was a pretty easy transition for me, right? High wing to low wing, Ford, Chevy in that world, right? Both probably have 160 or 180 horsepower. Both have six packs. Both have throttles. Both have mixtures. Very few of those have constant speed props. When I went to the 182, which was my first add-on endorsement after I became a private pilot, I was shocked when the instructor gave me that first lap, right? Cow flaps. I was having trouble doing gumps on the downwind in the 172. Now we're doing cow flaps. We're dealing with the prop. We're dealing with the mixture. Maybe not just in the pattern, but there was a lot to learn. And I learned how to fly that one aircraft for more or less for that endorsement. But you're really being endorsed to fly a lot of high-performing aircraft.
You are, but you'll also find, as you guys have pointed out on the show previously, insurance drives so many things much more than the FAA does. Particularly when you get into these higher performance aircraft, you're going to find that insurance is going to require you to have some type of type specific rating, if not necessarily a type rating, some type of type specific rating before insurance company is going to turn you loose in an airplane.
No doubt. So I've seen a friend recently buy a new twin engine aircraft for his personal use and family. First thing he had to do was get 25 hours of PSC time in that aircraft, or insurance wouldn't even touch him, right? Like there's no way. So you buy the plane, you're not legal to fly it or not allowed to fly based on insurance, but you might be legal to fly it based on the FAA. But you got to go out and spend 25 hours with an instructor to get you not type rated, but time in type is what I call it, right? To make sure that insurance company feels really good about it.
Yeah, and you're going to find that as you move into these higher performance, more complex airplanes, again, forget the book definitions for the FAA, that systems, some are going to be specific to that particular type of airplane. Some you're going to find translate between multiple aircraft. If you're talking about jet fuel pumps, and most light jets, they all operate fairly similar, but there may be something specific to the particular airplane that you're flying that requires some type of specific training.
Yep. And I'll go back to when I first got my complex endorsement. We had this school, before I owned it, had a Cessna 172 RG, and it had a hydraulic reservoir behind the cockpit or in the console there, and the gear was, you had to have hydraulic fluid to put the gear down. So we spent a lot of time on how that gear system works and what transits or what makes the gear go down and come out. And then that plane leaves, and I've got this complex endorsement, and an arrow shows up, and the gear works completely opposite of that, right? The hydraulic fluid is used to hold the gear up in place, but if you had no hydraulic fluid, it falls down. And I just can't stress enough to younger pilots that you really need to read the POH. Like, it's not the same plane anymore. Like, and that, while that's one minute variance between two complex aircraft, think about the things we've all three flown in our lives. There's a lot of nuances, and you just shouldn't get in a plane if you don't know how it works.
Yeah, systems become much more important as you move into more complex airplanes. You've really got to know the systems in the particular aircraft that you're flying.
And that's exactly why the FAA they try to require this, and that's why larger airplane, anything over 12,500 pounds, requires a type rating. So if you're type rated, you actually have that aircraft type printed on your pilot certificate. It will say Boeing 737 or Learjet 55 or whatever. You were certified for that airplane by the FAA. The problem is in smaller airplanes we don't have that. So, just looking at displays. I mean, if we were to walk through this airport that we're at, probably 50% would have. I'm talking about little airplanes. 50% would probably have some sort of 6-pack, and 50% would have a glass panel. I'm just guessing that it's maybe 50-50 at this point. But, when I issue an instrument rating to somebody today in a 172 that's got a 6-pack, tomorrow they're legal to go fly a Warrior with a G1000 or a full glass panel. And you're legal to do that. Now, most people would say, I wouldn't do that. I would never do that.
And this flight school won't let you.
Exactly, yeah. And that's where hopefully insurance says, hey, you've got to have some time with this type of display.
Sure. You got to be checked out in those things for sure. Something that always comes up in this conversation, and we're hopscotching a little bit, but the FAA really doesn't require me to fly a complex anymore, Wally, and I'm going to meet you for my commercial check ride next week, and I may have never ever used a gear switch in a cockpit. What are your thoughts on why maybe the FAA is doing that, or what they're thinking, and what you deal with on a daily basis? And maybe to you too, Travis, you cycle gear every time you fly now. How important is that people do it, and how do we ensure that we're doing the right things when we're flying like that?
I think it's very important. I think legally now. This rule changed probably about 3 to 4 years ago, but let's just say 10 years ago, for a commercial pilot applicant had to have 10 hours of complex time. So you would see that in the logbook, but probably about 4 years ago, the rule changed to you had to have 10 hours of complex or 10 hours of technically advanced, or any combination of the two.
Right. And so I guess if logged correctly, and I don't want the FAA to come calling me, but if logged correctly, I could fly a G1000 in my private training, be taught the rules and lessons of a commercial pilot at 10 of those hours that didn't apply until much later in my flying, and never fly even a TAA or complex airplane again after my private pilot certificate's been given to me. That's kind of interesting that you could do that. Well, you talked about, I think last week, that we said you can get an instrument rating without ever actually doing some of the instrument stuff, meaning never fly an actual and do these things, right? It's a weird world that we live in, that there are these rules that let us kind of get away with some nuances that just in some cases might not be possible. I think the FAA did it. I think I read an article on this, but it's very hard for flight schools to have complex aircraft and keep them up, right? They're very expensive. A gear actuator could cost $12,000, and there's 3 of them in those aircraft. So I think that they started moving away from it for one of those. Is one of the reasons. But our chief's adamant. I think it's important that you should cycle the gear. You should fly complex. You should at least get the 10 hours in complex. You're talking 250 hours of flight time. 10 of them in a complex aircraft is not too much to ask, right?
Yeah, and it's really just an introduction to what you can expect to see in the future. I mean, it's just getting those basics, but as you move into bigger aircraft, while you were talking about the type rating, it requires a type rating because it's unique. It's got unique systems. It may have unique flight characteristics that are different than another type of aircraft, and that's the whole purpose for the type rating. But even in smaller airplanes, you're going to see those differences from one type to another, and you kind of owe it to yourself to know and learn those systems that are specific to that aircraft.
Well, what was interesting when I flew with you was while the avionics looked like Glass Avionics to me, it was a completely different avionics company, and things weren't the same, right? So you envision that the buttons all do the same thing because most of us fly, I would assume, with Garmin products, and that's kind of what flight schools have around them. But there are many different avionics types of packages.
There are, even with the glass cockpit stuff. Most students that have any experience with technically advanced aircraft, it's going to be Garmin. They're really the only ones that play in that space. Maybe you've got somebody with some, Aspen avionics or something like that, but you could pretty much expect it to be Garmin. And when you get up into the corporate world of larger aircraft, you probably got either Collins or Garmin, one of those two. You move into the bigger stuff, you might have Honeywell. You get into other systems, but they're all different.
They might do the same thing, but I found it interesting how I wasn't able to navigate as freely as I was in a G1000, for example.
It's about what you learn.
Yeah.
The Collins operate just on an almost opposite thought process than Garmin does, but.
It really does. So explain that, because I think that's interesting. Where in a Garmin you might push to select or turn to select, the Collins was completely backwards.
Yeah, it's the scratch pad is completely different. In Garmin, if you want to change a frequency, you touch the frequency and then put the number in. You want to change the squawk, you touch the squawk, then put the number in. Whereas on a Collins, you have a scratch pad. You're putting in the number and then putting it where you want it to go.
So to change the radios, in essence, I would put 118.4 in the scratch pad, and then I would hit COM1
and drop it in.
And not even really do I put in 118.4 because it's a jet. I only put in 18.4, which my brain could never.
And you don't even need the point, just 184 and drop it.
There you go, exactly. Yeah, I kept putting in 118, going, oh no, that's not right. 184. It was very, very different for me.
The biggest takeaway from that, we talk about these minor differences in avionics. Again, it goes back to the systems are going to be appreciably different from one aircraft to another as you get into the bigger stuff.
Yeah, and then I think flying a plane by the numbers, to me, is you have to have a mindset of flying by the numbers. You have to know those performance charts. You have to know the POH. And I think I do that pretty well in the 1A2. And then again, I ride with you in a much larger jet. You know weights, distances, some of that's being calculated, but you're having to plan that based on the fuel that we load. And it's a lot by the numbers. And the air speeds, the VREF, and everything changes real time for you.
Everything's by the
Which does it in the smaller planes, but how many times do we really think about that? Do we really think between 65 and 67 for the speeds on landing?
No.
Based on max gross weight or whatever? No. But in a jet, you do.
It's all by the numbers. It's all by the book. But, let's just talk about checklists, for instance. Your checklist in your 172, Wally, I gave you a checklist out of a citation just by example. Even the checklists are more complex, and learning how to read and navigate those checklists is different than what you're used to in a smaller aircraft.
Well, the 172 is one sheet of paper front and back. The citation is 2 notebooks. Very different rules. And the way you talk about it's interesting to me too, because I think we have, in the GA world, we talk about flows and verifying via the checklist, right? I might do a flow I was taught called SLIM to turn all the switches off, pull the lean it to shut the engine off, ignition, and then master. And then I go back and check that with a checklist, verify that. In your world, you taught me there's memory items and then there's a checklist.
There's still flows. You're still doing flows. A taxi flow where you're going to go through and do all of the things, then go back through and check them with the checklist. But as far as checklist usage in flight, you kind of have memory items. And if something's not a memory item, it is definitely a checklist. Right. Somewhere there exists a checklist for that. And if it's not a memory item, you don't do it. You get the checklist out, you follow through that.
And there might be some short checklists, but most of them were pretty thorough checklists, right?
Most of them are pretty lengthy.
And you follow that to a T, because I don't know how you could possibly memorize the notebooks of the checklist, right? I mean, that's the reality of it.
Why they have them. And you have electronic checklists, Wally, or do you have paper checklists?
Well, they're on with the airline. They're on our iPad.
Okay.
So and it's very nice because there's all hyperlinks. You know, you might be on one checklist, and it will say because you're doing a less than flaps 30 landing, your landing distance is going to be different. So make sure you check the landing distance, and all you got to do is click on it, and it will take you to the proper landing distance chart. And so
you may have checklists that lead you to another
other
checklist, which
checklists.
leads you to another checklist.
Right.
Yeah, and I think we stress it often, but the checklist usage is very important. I flew my night currency last night and tried to reach for the checklist and read every word every time. But by the sixth lap, it got a little nauseating for me, so I probably didn't do it all 6 times or all 6 laps. But I think if I were to be flying something else, if I were flying with you, Travis, I guarantee you I would have read every line on those checklists to not just experience it, but to make sure I was acting like a professional pilot, right? It's very important. And
it's just learning a discipline. It really is learning a discipline. I remember one of my daughters just one time freaking out with me because she looked at the mileage on her car and looked at the sticker up in the top left corner and realized that she had gone 25 miles over the oil change requirement, and she thought the car was going to blow up, and I just kind of thought success, that's good. I'm glad she felt that way, and I said, well, let's get the oil changed. So she learned a little discipline, and hey, let's change the oil at the proper time on the car. We all know that the car is going to be just fine, but that's why in the 172 or the Warrior that there's not a whole lot on the checklist, the landing checklist. Flaps, okay, well, even if we don't land with flaps, it's probably not the end of the world. We add 35% to the landing distance. But you get into that bonanza, and now we have cowl flaps. Now we have a propeller that we need to have full forward in case we have to go around. And mainly, the big thing is we've got wheels that come down, and we don't want to land with those things up.
It's all about the discipline of that. The plane I usually fly before taxi checklist, there's a lot of things on it. And I typically fly single pilot, and I have a flow that I go through. I get interrupted, ATC call, something like that. I'll catch things on the checklist that I missed in my flow.
Yeah, we're all human. There's no question we're all human in that regard. The other thing that I want to talk about is staying in front of the aircraft. I think when we're flying 160 horsepower Warriors or 180 horsepower Warriors or Cessnas, we're probably never really getting into the 3 digits of airspeed, really. Maybe indicated, but not ground. And so things aren't, while they're moving faster than they did in the car, we're not overly anxious or rushed, right? Maybe when we first start our instrument training, we're not getting it all done in time, but there's not a lot of speed to it. But it is shocking what 140 feels like compared to 100, right? And there's
difference.
A lot of speed that happens. The pattern, what used to be 6 minutes is now 4.5 minutes, and that's a lot faster, right? That's almost 25% faster, and you got to be prepared for that. So you have to have discipline. You have to know that I need to use that checklist, that I might bust through traffic pattern altitude because I'm going to get there in half the time that I would in a 172, and then go through those checklist items to make sure you're configured for landing. And I do think it's discipline, but what I find shocking, as I've flown with both of y'all, and you both fly jets, you're way out in front of the aircraft. And I joke about Wally being thinking about the securing checklist when we're taking off, and I watched you, Travis, think about the airspace where we were going to be in an hour and a half long before I would have thought about it, right? And I don't think I ever thought that the descent from 35,000 feet was going to need to be started as soon as we started it, right? So there's a lot going on that you guys have been trained to do. How can we convey to younger pilots that might not fly the fastest things and might not ever get above 10,000 feet that staying in front of the aircraft is one of the best things they can do to become a great pilot?
Yeah, and they can start those habits now. Just as a for instance, your standby comm frequency. Don't wait till you need that. you got your ground frequency, put it in there. Put it in there halfway through the flight. You don't need to wait till you get close to your destination to stick that comm frequency. It's one less thing that you have to do. The more things that you can do ahead of time. You know, I fly with new guys, and you know, I'm like, okay, what are you going to do now? He's like, what do you mean? Yep. I said, what's next? Doesn't matter if it's 30 minutes from now. What's next? Be thinking about it now. But probably the biggest thing that I see people surprised by is how quickly things happen in a much faster airplane. If you're you've got to stay ahead of it.
Yep,
it's going to eat your lunch.
Well, and as we were in an arrival, being vectored around some tricky airspace, we'll call it, we get to about pattern altitude, and I was shocked how all that went really, really quick, right? And because I went somewhere I didn't know, I thought we were going to be in a right downwind. We were really in a left downwind. And if I would have been in control or pilot in command, I would have had to go around. It was way too much too quick. But you probably have been there and had thought about it. But not only had you been there and thought about it, you probably prepared for it before you even got there.
It just goes back to even just listening on the radio. You know, you're going to an airport. I was going into San Antonio yesterday. The frequency I'm on, I hear them tell the guy in front of me, contact tower, such and such frequency. That's my cue to immediately put that. I know that's the last approach controller I'm going to talk to. Tower's going to be next. Go ahead and punch that frequency in.
Wasn't too long ago, you were talking about that too. If you were going into Anaheim and the six aircraft in front of you do this at this point, you pretty much know you're going to get told the same thing.
Yeah, it happens coming into Houston all the time. We're just coming back from Amsterdam, and we were coming over the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and they were giving everybody ahead of us cross-torn at flight level 290. We were up at, I don't know, 37, 38, something like that, and after I heard them give it to the second guy, I went ahead and plugged that in the FMC to say, okay, I'm going to let this thing start thinking about being at torn at 290. Of course, we haven't been cleared for it, so it's not in our mode control panel yet, but at least we can start thinking about it and kind of planning for that descent. And sure enough, we were given cross torn at 290.
And I saw that with you too. When you were talking about the descent, you were programming where you thought you wanted to be way before we got there, so that you could watch the computers start telling you how many minutes were we from starting to go nose over to start that descent. So you don't think about that in a single engine prop plane, because you're probably going to pull power and put the nose over 3 or 4 miles from the airport, no matter what you're doing, right?
Yeah, when you're flying around at 450, 475 knots, things are happening a lot quicker. You really got to start planning that descent from 45,000 feet. It requires planning and a considerable amount of time. But just like you were talking about, I've gone to Teterboro, and I can hear the guys in front of me, proceed direct to such and such fix, hold as published. It's coming,
Right.
Look for that fix, find that holding pattern, and see what you're about to be doing.
And this can go back to the transitioning, to a complex airplane. A lot of people that we deal with around here are aspiring professional pilots, and they're coming up. They're getting their private, their instrument, and commercial, and maybe CFI. Then at some point, maybe they're multi-engine. When you get a multi-engine rating, it's most multi-engine trainers that I know of are complex airplanes. So if you're jumping into a twin-engine airplane for the first time and you've never pulled a gear up, that's just an extra thing. If you've got a little bit of time in an Aero or a 172 RG or something like that has a retractable gear, just going to make that transition to the multi-engine. That's just one less thing that maybe you don't have to think of as much. So I'm definitely an advocate of trying to get some complex time. I think technically advanced air stuff is a good use of your time.
Why not incorporate 10 of each, right? I mean,
right.
If it's available to you, go get 10 of each.
Right.
Maybe more than that. The other part, you talk about the gear. I don't fly something with the gear that goes up and down very regularly unless I'm flying the twin, which is not something that I'm proficient in. So when I do, I always got to think about the airspeeds that I have to be at, because that's something that's not ingrained in me. The flaps are ingrained in me, but I've got that number pretty memorized in the 182, but I don't have the gear number memorized in the twin. So that's something, if I was to go fly the twin today, I'd have to read the checklist and know all these numbers again. But it's not just doing it, it's also doing it right. And there's little things you have to know about all these systems.
Yeah, it's even speed limits. Suddenly you've got to start thinking about speed limits.
Right.
You've got to slow down to 250 knots below 10,000. You need
Right.
to be 200 knots or less underneath the shelf of the Bravo. Things that you're not used to.
Quick donning
used to
masks,
thinking
those
about.
sorts of things was really interesting when I flew with you, because yes, I remember memorizing all that stuff to take the written test for the commercial. I memorized and knew what those all requirements were when I took my check ride. But I had never flown anything that would put that practicality in front of me. And you talk about simulating real world. Most commercial pilots at flight schools, they've never experienced these things that are commercial requirements above 10,000 or speed limits that are around Bravo, right? Like, you just don't think about it.
Yeah, and thinking about your time of useful consciousness at 40,000 feet. That sometimes I sit there and think about it, and I'm like, this is spooky.
Yeah.
This is a hostile
Yeah.
atmosphere
Yeah.
on the other side of this window.
Right.
And by the way, this window's not that thick.
Yeah, it is a hostile atmosphere on the other side of that window. You're looking at negative 45 degrees Celsius outside on the temperature, and going, it's nice and warm in here.
Yep.
But,
Yeah. I will tell you, if you want a fun little airplane oxygen video to watch, just go to YouTube and type in Tom Cruise, David Letterman airplane video. It's about a 5.5 minute interview with Letterman interviewing Tom Cruise, and it's a pretty funny video. So just for your listening pleasure, take a listen to that.
We'll put that in the show notes for everybody.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you got the guys that say, no, I just want to fly for fun. I don't aspire to be a professional pilot. It's okay if you don't aspire to be a professional pilot, but aspire to fly like one.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that's one thing my CFI gave me when I was in my commercial multi-engine training. We went to Austin one time, and we were going to follow an Airbus in, which I'd never had done before. And they told us to descend from 7,500 feet to some altitude at some fix. And I was just outside the yellow arc on a very clear, calm day. I was just inside the green, I guess, right? And he goes, they want you down. Like, fly like a commercial pilot. And I said, what do you mean? I'm flying good. I'm outside the yellow arc. He goes, get in the yellow arc. What's the yellow arc mean? Only if it's turbulent, right? He goes, it's pretty smooth up here. They want you to get down. Use all that energy we wasted to climb. Use that to get in. And I really hold that with me, that he told me to fly like a commercial pilot, because I wasn't. But there is an aspect to that, right? Fly like a pro, be a pro, know what pros are doing, try to emulate some of that stuff. You'll be better. Speaking of, maybe I just want to fly for fun. A lot of guys and girls who just want to fly for fun, they're thinking about that airplane purchase. The three of us have had this conversation probably with many, many people, and people walk in here all the time. I might want to lease back something. I want to buy and build my time in something. What are you looking for? A Warrior or a 172? I want a 172. I'm like, okay, whatever you're going to tell me you want, you're going to want the next thing. I can assure you right now. That's my go-to answer. 172 is never going to be enough. 182 is never going to be enough. You'll be looking at 206s. As soon as you get in the 182, you'll be looking at 206s. As soon as you get in the 206, you'll be looking at something else. So what's your common advice when someone says, Wally, I think I'm going to buy a Cherokee 140?
I grew up in North Louisiana, so I got a lot of redneck blood in me. I grew up shooting guns. And, the first gun that a young kid probably shoots is other than a BB gun, it's probably a 22. Yep. And you go, pow, 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 and go, boy, this is really fun. This piece of lead's tearing stuff up. Yeah, that's really cool. I would never want to shoot anything else. Oh, what is that? Man, that makes a lot of noise. A 9mm? Well, let me try that. Oh, wow, that's cool. Oh, a 357? You I don't know if
there's a level of progression that occurs.
Yeah.
It's human nature.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of people buy planes. I've seen a lot of people buy multiple planes, and I've seen a lot of them sell those planes they bought before the other planes, right? I think there's a real aspect to you're going to keep upgrading. You're going to want to keep upgrading. Not saying don't buy, don't get involved, but I think you need to think about your mission for your aircraft. And I say this a lot. If you have a family of 4, you're probably not going to want to buy a Warrior if you think you're going to take your family of 4 on trips. It's just not realistic.
Yeah.
The usable load will never be there. You can't take enough fuel out to make that reasonable to go places. And while you might not be able to afford a CJ4, okay, there's something in there between that you can probably get that'll help you accomplish your mission. I have a friend who I know has now bought 5 aircraft from Canada, wanted to fly home to Canada, and has never bought a plane with an icing system on it, right? It's just not probably going to be practical. You're not going to get there very often unless you put some boots on something and make it to where you can get a little bit of ice on that airplane, because it's pretty freaking cold in Canada. So buy something that's really going to help you with your mission, and you'll be better off.
And I couldn't agree more. Somebody tells me they're looking for an airplane. The first question is, what's your 90% mission? What are you doing with it 90% of the time?
And mine is go to Austin. And if I'm going to go to Austin, a 1A2 is an ideal ship for me going to Austin. Would I like a Vision Jet? Sure. My mission and my wallet have to cross paths at some point. So I fly a 1A2. That's what I do.
I saw a poster many, many years ago, and it holds true today, and it says there's 2 kinds of pilots: those who fly jets and those who want to fly jets.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty true. Yeah. Well, your, I'll call it personal ride is a Saratoga. Your family of 4 can fly in your Saratoga.
Yeah.
You can get places. You can take those trips and missions. So there's aircraft out there. It doesn't have to be an SR-22 for everything, people. I know it's a pretty sexy aircraft, but it's not the only thing that families of 4 can fly in. And do some research, find something that fits your mission and your wallet, and I think you'll be happy for it. Hopefully, you'll get your high-performance endorsement, your complex endorsement, and be able to fly many other aircraft that you haven't been able to fly before. Soon we'll talk more about those aircraft, and we'll talk a little bit about light twins in an episode we'll call Behind the Props, coming soon. As always, fly safe and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.